Hello there, Flip here, and today we can finally get a peek at what I've been working months on, and well, I would assume you read the title, so let me go ahead and explain. What I plan to cover, which I've seen no other creator dive into at least recently, is team building and how to build teams as a whole. So I plan to go into the theory for building teams around every single reaction and element first, and then I plan to cover each character individually and their teams. Also, I will be touching on Dendro teams at the end of the video too. I just want to say that no matter my best efforts, I cannot cover every single team for every character possible, so I'll only really cover the relevant ones and some niche fun teams. And I also can't go into depth of the builds for each character because that would make this already egregiously long video even longer, so I'll only cover the build when necessary for the team to function. Keep in mind that I'm also only going to be covering all the popular team archetypes before version 3.0. The characters I cover in this video may get more teams in the future, but as of now, these will be the current dominant teams without factoring in Dendro. And just to let you know, if you have any comments regarding specific builds or just some questions in general, make sure to comment them and I'll be happy to respond and give more insight, or you can join my Discord server and ask me there. Most of the info I will be covering will be based on the stuff from the KQM guides or the beautiful people here that have helped me make this. Also, if I didn't decide to be a lazy shit, there should be timestamps, so I would really advise you to just watch the first part of the video and then just go to the sections you want to watch, instead of trying to watch this whole video in bulk, but I know that's not going to stop some people, so do what you like. And lastly, before we get into it, I worked really hard to try and get the most accurate info for these characters and teams. So even though you are not at all obligated or pressured to do so, I would really appreciate if you could like, comment and share this video. Thank you, and now without further ado, let's get into talking about elements and how their teams are built, going by infusion priority. So we'll be starting with everyone's favorite element, Pyro. Damage. That's kind of it. Pyro's placement in team building is either one of two things generally: Bennett, who helps you do a lot of damage by boosting your character's attack by a fuck ton, or they are usually the main source of damage in your team. So let's give an overview of how pyro damage dealers generally work. In Genshin, there is something called ICD, or internal cooldown, and this is essentially to stop you from doing a lot of elemental reactions with the same abilities. That's why when you do a normal attack on Hu Tao, not everything is going to vaporize, but some abilities in this game have a very short ICD, or just none at all, which is apparent in someone like Hu Tao's charge attacks, as its ICD is only 0.5 seconds, which is so short that you essentially vaporize every charge attack on Hu Tao. This is around the same principle that goes into every pyro damage dealer, as their most damaging and weavable abilities like Diluc's elemental skill, Xiangling's Pyronado, hell even Bennett's E has little to no ICD. So usually the best way to utilize them is to try and proc an elemental reaction on these weavable strong abilities, in which one of the best ways to do so is through vaporize teams. So for simplicity's sake, let's assume we are talking about reverse vaporize, which would be a pyro application on top of a hydro aura. I'm gonna touch on forward vaporize when talking about the hydro element, but since pyro is the one that triggers this type of vaporize, we will be covering it. Reverse vaporize will give you a 1.5 times multiplier on top of the damage you do, which if you can't tell already is one of the reasons pyro damage dealers can output a lot of damage. The way you want to build these vaporize teams is to have a pyro damage dealer, and then the only two characters currently that can sustain an on-field pyro damage dealer will be Eula or Jingqiu. And then the third slot here will generally be a Bennett, and you have the vaporize core. And then from this, there are actually 3 sub-teams you can build off of the vape core, which all work quite well. The most common and generally the strongest all-purpose vape teams will be viridescent vape teams. This is where you will put an Onimo unit, preferably Kazuha or Sucrose, in the last slot for their massive resistance shred from the viridescent set, and their amping bonuses like Kazuha's damage bonus or Sucrose's elemental mastery bonus. Kazuha and Sucrose both perform relatively equal here, so it doesn't matter that much who you use. As for other Onimo options, you can use Venti if a lot of crowd control is required, but and you can also use Heizou here with TTDS, but again Sucrose and Kazuha are generally just better here than any other Onimo option. And then the second vape core here would be double hydro, which became a thing due to the addition of bulk cut number 2. It's the exact same principle except you replace the Onimo slot with the other off-field hydro, and this gives you a crazy amount of single target damage output while also just being extremely brain dead to play. When you're in AoE content, you would most likely be better off using the Verdescent variant for grouping and crowd control, but even for that type of content, this is still amazing because you will most likely be able to burst down a group of enemies and go to the next one. And closing off the Vaporized core, we have Overvape teams, in which the last slot of your Vape core goes to Fischl. Some may think to use Raiden here, but unless it's Zhongli, Raiden kind of just doesn't have the off-field electro application due to ICD. Overvape is another very single target oriented vape archetype, but it does actually compensate for this by being relatively equal to double hydro and damage output. Pyro characters build a decent amount of EM regardless, and with the way Electro Charge works, where you keep both a hydro and electro aura on the enemy simultaneously, you are able to both vaporize and overload the same hit, resulting in additional ticks of damage for every vape you do. This does knock back smaller enemies, which can be annoying, which is generally why you want to use this against heavier enemies. And now going over Overload Combs, which is a reaction where you combine Pyro and Electro and things go boom. It's effectively the same logic. Bennett your Pyro carry, and now instead of a Hydra you put Fischl here, and then any other Electro unit, Venti or Kazuha. Pure Overload teams are fun, but none are really all that strong. Overload comps currently, except one exception, are essentially just a flex of your strong Pyro and Electro characters. Okay, so now Melt. Melt with a Pyro carry is very hard to sell or recommend because of the fact that Pyro will eat the Cryo Aura at essentially double the rate that it eats through a Hydro Aura. You will almost always never have enough or fast enough Cryo application to sustain a forward Melt comp, which is why it's not really worth that big of a mention, and I would just stick to using your Pyro carry on a Vaporized team. And now to end off Pyro, even though it isn't really a reaction, it's a Pyro core good enough to mention, and that is Mono Pyro teams. Get Bennett, Zhongli, and an Onimo unit, and slot in most Pyro carries here, and they will do very well for a massive amount of AoE and good single target damage output. And now going by infusion priority, the next element we will cover... oh god. So Hydro in meta and team building is actually the most valued element because of how good all the reactions are, and a lot of top meta teams would just completely crumble without a Hydro character. This is one of the main reasons why Xingqiu was just a staple and valued character in Genshin's meta, and why even Hydro characters that seem somewhat bad on the surface, like Kokomi, are actually very valued. So with forward vaporized teams, which would just be a Hydro application on top of a Pyro Aura for a 2x amp to your damage, those teams kind of just don't exist. Hydro characters don't have the same structure with how they're designed to even make a forward vaporized comp worth running on them. So going over to Electro Charge, this forms the Taser archetype, which is a Hydro character, an Onimo character, Fischl usually but not in all cases, and then either another Electro or another Onimo, and of course double Hydro also works here as well. Taser teams bank on the simultaneous aura interaction between Hydro and Electro, and the fact that they can both be swirled at the same time. Since the swirl reaction besides Hydro swirls scales semi-quadratically, which means that you can get 2 instances of swirl per enemy and element, this allows for these swirls and the EC reaction to chain across enemies, giving a lot of sustained AoE damage, and because of how flexible the Taser team archetype is, you can even opt to use a more single target focused variant like double Hydro Taser with Eula and Xingqiu. Kokomi, Ayato, and Barbara are all good Hydro drivers for this team archetype. Now going over freeze teams are just so dominant in Genshin's meta from basically 1.2 to around 2.6, where MiHoYo probably realized that they couldn't let the cycle continue. Freeze allows for Cryo and even Hydro carries to utilize the 4 Blizzard set and Cryo Resonance, giving a massive 110 crit value to your characters, making damage flow extremely consistent. And the perma crowd control from Freeze allows all your attacks to hit unfreezable enemies, and they won't be able to dodge or teleport out of it. The Freeze core now normally will use one Hydro character being Kokomi or Mona, a Cryo carry, which is going to usually be Ayaka or Ganyu, a Cryo support / battery, which you would use Rosaria, Kaeya, Shenhe, and Diona for, and the last slot is going to be an Onimo unit. There are also quick swap freeze comps that use Kaeya and Rosaria as the 2 Cryo slots, and an offensive Hydro character instead of a supportive one, so bring out the bull cuts. Speaking of said bull cuts, there's the double Hydro team core that can effectively be used anywhere just because of how well this duo complements each other. Xingqiu allows Eula to do more damage by lowering her energy requirement and is buffs through constellations. and Jilon just kind of, does a lot of damage through this, while also lowering Xingqiu's energy requirement and buffing the on-field character through her passive. You can use this double Hydro core with other Hydro characters, Pyro characters, Raiden, etc. If you are lacking single target damage, go ahead and run them. And next on the infusion priority, we have my favorite element, Electro. Electro is one of the most overlooked elements by a lot of the general community despite how good its reactions are and its placement in the meta. Electro, or well, Fischl and Raiden, acts as a supporting element that complements many team comps ever present in its reactions. It can also double as a damaging element using very powerful character with high scalings to dish out a lot of damage. What Electro does in its resonance and present in almost all the characters' kits is also very oriented to being able to get energy back and cycle again through these high damaging elemental bursts. As listed in the Hydro section, the Taser Team archetype also likes to use a second Electro character along with Fischl. Yaimiko, Beidou, and even Raiden go great here strengthening the Taser core. Moving on from Taser, as this is where most of the reactions start to overlap, we have Electro focused overload comps which, again as stated previously, as long as you slap together good invested Pyro and Electro characters together, assuming they can get energy back, you should be fine for whatever overload team you go to run. Kuki and Lisa have overload teams and are good at triggering them, but almost every other Electro character will usually be enabling overload instead of actually proccing it. Now, Superconduct. Superconduct reduces physical resistance, which isn't that beneficial to Electro damage dealers, and only really benefits Razor on the Electro side. Overall, there's not really much at all you can do with this reaction as it's very straightforward. Apply Cryo and apply Electro, and the enemy will take a lot more physical damage. I guess this does actually give some leeway to talk about physical teams. Physical teams are fine for early game content, and you can make anyone a physical damage dealer besides Catalyst users. Just pair them with a Cryo and Electro unit, and since most physical damage dealers use normal attacks, you can just slap Yunjin on there. But to be completely honest, I wouldn't really at all recommend going for physical teams unless you are playing Eula, but that's just how they would be built. And now moving on to the last on the infusion priority, Cryo. So Cryo's placement in the meta, despite being the direct contrast to Pyro, is also generally due to its damage dealers and how much output they do. Cryo reactions besides Melt also seem to be about debuffs and crowd control, which especially for freeze comps warrant them being some of the most consistent and high damaging teams in the game. So now that we are on the topic of Cryo, we can talk about Melt teams in more depth, or more specifically reverse Melt teams, which are a Cryo application on top of a Pyro aura to give you a 1.5 times damage multiplier. The reverse Melt team will require a Cryo damage dealer, of course, Bennett, a Pyro applicator that is normally Zhongli, but an Anemo character that can self-infuse like Jin or Kazuha works great. And then you can add in another Cryo damage dealer at the end, and there you get the reverse Melt team core. Rosaria, Kaeya, Bennett, Zhongli is an example of how this works, with them being interchangeable with someone like Chongyun. This team works well because you are able to chain Melt reactions and abilities like Rosaria's burst and Chongyun's burst that have no ICD, meaning you are able to melt all these high damaging abilities, and then add in someone like Zhangling's personal output, and it shouldn't be hard to see why this team core is relatively strong. I've also already talked about what goes into building Superconduct and Freeze teams, so we can actually skip over that and go to now talk about Anemo. Anemo, being one of the strongest supporting elements due to Viridescent, is almost a staple to all elemental teams in Genshin. Anemo characters also mostly have crowd control components built into them, making them amazing for multi-target situations. Swirl is a reaction that reacts with Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo that basically distributes the element it swirls out in an AoE and deals an instance of damage. In AoE situations, these swirls can chain, especially more so when more enemies are involved. As I said before, most elemental teams will want an Anemo character, so if you already have a team drafted with 3 characters, putting an Anemo unit as the 4th slot will almost never go wrong. Another thing you can do with Anemo if you want to dog walk and eviscerate any mobbing floor is to run a double Anemo team, usually with Venti and Kazuha, but they can be of course subbed for any other Anemo unit. Put these two characters together and then any other character that can dish out good elemental application, and boom, you have cleared all the enemies. You usually want the last two slots of this team to be an Electro and Hydro character because of how the Electro Charge interaction works, and it is probably the most powerful way to use this team as it capitalizes on the chain swirls. Another team archetype there is are soup teams. Soup teams got popularized when theory crafters figured out what Sucrose is and how it's possible to chain a 4-element reaction simultaneously. With Sucrose in particular, the principle is that you apply Electro Charge to an enemy, and then since Goba has a Pyro Aura on him, if you get someone like Sucrose who is actually capable of swirling the Pyro Aura on Goba, you can swirl the Electro, Hydra and Pyro Auras. This can also be enacted by Bennett and Kazuha. Get Bennett, Kazuha and any Electro and Hydro character that can apply consistently, and you get your soup team. The Electro and Hydro character of your choice will apply Electro Charged, and if you are in Bennett's ring, Kazuha's burst should infuse with Pyro, causing him to react with both the Electro and Hydro Aura on the enemy. These teams have great AoE, and since they do a lot of transformative reactions, they are also very consistent. That mostly covers all the main archetypes of Onoma teams, and now going from the element that reacts with everything, we can go into the element that reacts with basically nothing. Geo. So Xiao is very tricky because since Xiao's reaction is crystallized, which isn't all that great and doesn't really do that much for actual combat, Xiao's place in the meta is solely predicated on how good the characters themselves are. Besides double Xiao, which can give a team duo a decent boost through Xiao resonance, Xiao again isn't actually slotted because of its element, but actually just because of the characters. There is also the choice of just running them all together for Mono Xiao because they have no other synergy besides that. Mono Xiao is also quite self-explanatory. Use a Xiao DPS, primarily Itto or Noelle, Gorou, and 2 Xiao units of your choice, and you will most likely want one of them to be Albedo or Zhongli, and there you go, Mono Xiao. And now that we have covered all the elements and the reactions, Shatter doesn't exist. We can now go over some terminology and clear definitions for them, so that when I go over all the characters it will make a lot more sense. So let's just get the most annoying one: main DPS, sub DPS, all of that. First, to clear confusion, main DPS doesn't necessarily have to be the on-field character. One of the most notable examples being Xiangling on the national team. Xiangling will normally output the most amount of damage on this team, even if it's completely off field, so many would still classify her as the main DPS of the team, and she's the primary source of damage, and that's how I'll be referring to the characters like that. And regarding sub DPS, can we just please get rid of that word at this point, so it's less confusing? Most people just say on-field and off-field damage dealers, or DPS, when referring to characters that are slotted on the team for damage, but not the primary source of damage like the main DPS. Another word for a main DPS would also be to classify them as a carry, since you know they will essentially be carrying the bulk of the damage. So you can say on-field carry looking at characters like Xiao and Eula, and then off-field carry regarding characters like Xiangling and Beidou. Going on to other terms, one I'll be mentioning a lot is called a driver. On a team, a driver's purpose is to proc a lot of the off-field damage dealer's abilities. Let's just take Sucrose for example. Sucrose has really fast attacks and also has the benefit of being Onoma for swirls, so she can proc abilities like Fischl C6 and Jingcho's Rain Swords very quickly, making her a good driver. Any character in this game can drive abilities, but the ones that attack faster with better frame data are generally the ones you want to use. You also really want to use characters that are able to enable while they drive. And would you look at that, that perfectly moves us on to the next term we call an enabler. An enabler is a character that can apply a lot of their element to allow someone else of another element to capitalize and trigger a reaction from it. There can be on-field enablers like Child and Raiden, and there can be off-field enablers like Jingcho and Fischl. Due to this definition, Onoma characters aren't inherently actually enablers, but on a team like Melt Ganyu, Kazuha can act as an enabler through infusing his burst with Pyro, making him a Pyro enabler for Ganyu to melt her blooms. And sure, let's look at the most boring one, supports. Supports in Genshin are often classified by offering some sort of defensive utility or mitigation through things like healing or shielding, and then there's also supports that support by offering a way to boost their damage, and then there's characters like Bennett who say fuck it, let me do both. Another type of term that can be used are quick swap units, which are a majority of characters in this game actually. These are damage dealers that use their skill and burst instantly and switch out. They are very low field time units and normally leave an ultimate behind. A good example of this is Rosaria. And then on the complete opposite end we have hyper carries. These characters take up a lot of field time and have a majority of the damage dealt on the team will be them, and their teammates will be all geared around buffing them. Let's just take a look at best girl Eula as an example for this. There's also Xiao too. And one thing I'm realizing I overlooked, which is a very important detail, is rotations and energy. A rotation is the series of abilities you do on all your characters before you have to reset their abilities. Rotations will generally be around 20 seconds on the lower end and up to 30 seconds on the higher end. They are also going to be gated by character cooldowns, so the way you want to use your characters most of the time is to go from the abilities with the longest duration to the abilities with the shortest ones. This is why it is recommended you start with most abilities like Xingqiu's burst, Zhongli's skill, and Raiden's skill, etc. Another reason for this is also buff uptime, as you want to give the most buffs to your main DPS at any given time. This will of course vary from character to character and team to team, so I can't really give an overview for it, but just look at each buff's duration and have the shorter one closer to the main DPS. And then you also have characters like Zhongli who can snapshot 20 different buffs onto one ability, because why not? And then the most important thing to a rotation that allows you to even do damage is energy, because if you aren't bursting, you aren't most of the time doing damage. You want to have a sufficient enough energy on all your characters so you don't have to extend or mess up your rotations by having to wait to do an extra skill. This is why weapons like Favonius and Sacrificial series are so valuable to a lot of supports, and even their best in slot weapons. And another way to solve energy issues you may face is through the last term I'll cover, which is called a battery. A battery is basically any unit that produces a lot of energy for another unit. Two of the most popular examples are Bennett, who with his skill generates a lot of energy for the energy black hole that is Zhongli, and Fischl, who generates a lot of energy for a character like Beidou or Yai with a very high burst cost. And as I am writing this script, I just realized now I literally just could have said Raiden, who can battery every single unit on her team. Alright, now with all the boring stuff out of the way, we can now get into the bulk of what most of you came here for. I will now be covering the theory into building teams for every single character in Genshin, even Jinyan. So going by alphabetical order by element by character, let's get into it. Denim jeans. Building Jean teams is somewhat simple because she has many roles that you can fit her in. Whether that is as an Onimo sub DPS or you are a Sunfire Giga Chad, Jean is a very good and versatile character because she happens to be a healer who can heal alongside contributing a lot to the team's overall output. Going over her role as an Onimo sub DPS where you'd want to build her with ADC, she is going to be the 4 Viridescent slot that almost every team wants. The reason why I covered how most of the team archetypes are built is so I can point to characters like Jean for the flexible element slot. Let's look at freeze teams. Let's say we have Ayaka, Rosaria, Mona, and now we need an Onimo slot. You now have Jean who can consolidate roles by being able to give your team access to 4 Viridescent, while also giving your team supportive utility. This is basically the principle behind how building Jean teams as an Onimo sub DPS work. You have 3 offensive damage dealers, but now you need an Onimo character and your mitigation and just put on your Jeans. There is also Jean on Xiao teams where you can opt to use her on 4 Noblesse instead to buff Xiao. And one of the last things you can do with Jean is double Onimo teams, especially with Venti. I covered most of the explanation in the Onimo section. Lastly, there is Sunfire Jean, which uses a very cool interaction of Jean and Bennett's abilities. When you stand in Bennett's ultimate, you constantly apply Pyro Aura onto yourself. And with the way Jean's ultimate works, if there's an element on your character, Jean's field will swirl the elemental aura off of you. But since Bennett keeps reapplying the Pyro Aura on you, Jean keeps swirling it off of you, creating the Sunfire interaction, which dishes out an insane amount of Pyro application. One of the ways to capitalize on this is through Raiden and a Hydro character. Raiden and a Hydro character apply Electro Charge to an enemy, Jin applies Pyro and overloads and vaporizes the electro-charged aura. Hopefully that made sense. There's also the fact you can use this as a substitute for Zhongli and Melt Ganyu if you hate Zhongli for some reason. And there are also a ton of other possibilities, but they'd be way too niche to list. Also, you build Jin on full elemental mastery in this team. There is no escaping Viridescent hell. You know, I really dreaded this the most, but Kazuha. This surprisingly shouldn't be that bad, as again you place Kazuha wherever you need your Anima slot, which I covered all in the overview for the teams. So Kazuha can be used well in double Anima quickswap. He can also be an enabler for a lot of reactions, especially Pyro ones, like how Jin can be an enabler for Melt Ganyu. Since Kazuha gives an elemental damage bonus, which is very valuable to any elemental based damage dealer, you can run Bennett Kazuha, your elemental DPS of choice, and a support for said DPS, and you can build a hyper carry archetype of team. 80% of the time this will be an Electro or Pyro character. There are also mono teams comprised of 3 units of the same element with Kazuha to buff them all together. One thing about Kazuha that you'd want to do to push into his high ceiling is to use double swirl setups, allowing him not only to give his elemental damage bonus to 2 elements, but also shred the resistances of both simultaneously. I'll cover the double swirl setups for some teams if I can, but if you want to know where you can find a double swirl guide for almost all Kazuha teams, so Jeff, one of the most prominent theory crafters, made a very good video on it. Usually you would want to put Kazuha on 4 Viridescent with Elemental Mastery of course, but there is a team comp with him that people find very fun, which is putting Kazuha on a 4 Thundering Fury set. The idea behind it is that in AoE, Kazuha will be able to trigger electro reactions that gives him a very short skill cooldown, allowing him to become the stripper everyone wanted him to be. You can use an overload variant with Bennett and Fischl and another Anima user that'll be holding 4 Viridescent like Venti, or you can just use Beidou. There is also the Electro Charge variant that uses Fischl and Jingcho, with another Anima unit holding 4 Viridescent, or Beidou. I wish I could just say a shitty joke and pretend Sayu isn't real, but unfortunately let's get into it. Sayu is similar to the archetype of sub DPS Jean where you can use her anywhere you really need an Anima unit. Unique to Sayu however would sort of be her Taser and Soup archetypes. Since Sayu is a Claymore character, surprisingly, her attacks are really slow to warrant her even being a good Taser driver, so the way you run her, well, is to not run at all but to spin. Sayu, Barber or Kokomi with Fischl and then a flex slot is really fun and works okay. You just use Fischl and Kokomi's abilities and get to spinning. There is also the route cursed by every god known to man, the Zhangling route. Sayu, Bennett, Zhangling, and then someone who works well here is Kuki for consistent overload procs off field, and even mono pyro teams with another Anima unit like Venti is where she can shine. This is a complete opposite problem to Sayu, where he's actually a very good driver for Taser teams. Heizou gets most benefit from being able to drive a lot of off-field damage dealer's abilities, since he can attack really fast and he can get a lot of swirls with his normal and charge attack combo. A good example of this would be a more single target oriented Taser team, replacing Beidou or your other Electro character with Eula. Heizou also seems to have Sayu's issue to where he can't group that well or effectively, so he doesn't abuse swirls as great. This does actually give him a lot of flexibility in his artifacts, as he is able to run almost anything and it will be relative to the other options, but preferably ADC on Heizou will be his best option. Besides Taser teams, Heizou fits in a lot of the other Anima cores I listed previously. Heizou can also use Tomo well for an Overload or Overvape team that doesn't need Bennett. The principle behind it is that your Hydra will most likely be Jingcho, and Fischl will apply Electrocharged. Heizou will continuously swirl this and occasionally Toma will over-vaporize the Electrocharged aura. And that's basically it. Just pair Heizou with a lot of strong off-field damage dealers and he'll do well. Moving on to the Reckless Palad's victim, Sucrose. She's amazing and probably the most straightforward out of all the Animo characters. As an Animo support, seeing as Sucrose gives an elemental mastery bonus, it is very appreciated to use her on vaporized teams to further boost the ceiling of her pyro carry. She buffs multiplicative reactions more than the other Animo options generally, especially if you're running lower elemental mastery. Also, something to keep in note about Sucrose is that it's also possible to do double swirl setups effectively on her as well. One of the best techniques to do so is on vaporized teams is the Goba swirl. Guoba for some reason has a pyro aura on him that is interactable. With the right timing, Sucrose is able to swirl the pyro aura on Guoba onto enemies, reducing pyro resistances. So if you're using a Zhangling vaporized team, you can get very consistent double swirl setups through this by applying Hydro onto the enemy, dropping Guoba down, wait a few seconds after he eats the chili and swirl him. This also helps set up teams like Sucrose, which I'll cover in Kokomi section. The other side to Sucrose is to use her as a driver. Sucrose can also get out a lot of attacks, and since she has a lot of separate abilities with different ICDs, her skill, her charge attacks, and her normal attacks, she can get out a lot of swirls while also having consistent grouping for AoE swirls. You would standardly put her on a taser team to drive Fischl, Beidou, and Jingqiu, but there are a lot of ways the taser core can be made. Also, this might be a lot more niche and not a team comp that is consistent, but Sucrose helps set up a lot of one-shot team compositions with character with nukes like Child, Hu Tao, and the likes of them. He amasses a black hole that pulls enemies in. That's kind of it. Okay, to be more genuine, Venti has a lot more to his kit which is vastly underlooked. Venti at the end of his burst is able to refund 15 energy to sustain rotations. Also, one quick thing to clear up about Venti is that he actually sucks up more enemies than he doesn't, and unique to him, when frozen he's even capable of pulling in the rune enemies, and ever since the Spectre changes he's good against them as well. As with all characters listed before, Venti can be used in any of the animal cores I mentioned, but for being more specific, if I'm going to be talking about Venti, it's basically illegal to not talk about Morgana, which is a freeze team with Ganyu and Venti. Ganyu's ultimate scales quadratically up to 5 targets, meaning that you do significantly more damage to each target the more enemies there are until you reach 5 targets. This team then wants a Hydro applicator that would preferably be Kokomi or Mona, and a cryo character that can be any of the ones on screen. So then covering Venti, Electrocharged, and Soup teams, a lot of people seem to think that the element Venti infuses his ultimate with is the element he will swirl, but that's not necessarily true. The element Venti's burst is infused with will deal that type of damage and apply a unit of the element infused. So for Venti Soup teams, if you have a Pyro infused Venti burst with their Electro and Hydro characters applying an Electrocharged aura onto the enemy infused, you will be swirling Electro and Hydro inside Venti's burst, while Venti also overloads and vaporizes with the Pyro he infused his bursts with, which is what goes behind building Venti Soup teams. You want good Electro and Hydro application, and then you can use any Pyro character, but most likely it'll be Bennett. An example of this team would be Bennett, Raiden, and Jingqiu. As a Electrocharged team, it is essentially the same principle, but your lost team slot, instead of a Pyro unit, will most likely be an Anemo character, like Jin or Kazuha. Now rounding out the last of the Anemo characters with the shortest one, we have Xiao. Xiao's core strengths are his sustained AoE damage and his flexibility within team options. Since Xiao is a hyper carry, most of the time, and most of the damage is loaded onto him regardless, he isn't burdened by being fully dependent on another specific unit. Xiao mix and match teams are a prime example of this. Just get Xiao and an Anemo battery, which will most likely be Sucrose, Sayu, or Jin, and you can run most off-field damage dealers or supports in the last 2 slots and get a competent Xiao team. Some of the best slots to use here for off-field damage dealers can be Fischl, Albedo, Rosaria, or Zhongli, and supports Bennett, Diona, or Zhongli. The more popular Xiao hypercarry cores is Double Geo, giving Xiao benefit from Geo Resonance, as well as having Zhongli and Albedo's abilities be able to last for his full ultimate duration. This is because one of Xiao's biggest downsides, besides his absolutely atrocious design, is the fact that most support abilities disappear before his ultimate duration is up, leaving the tail end of his rotations without extra off-field damage or support. Both Zhongli and Albedo have long enough abilities to where this isn't that big of an issue. But if you want to move a bit away from the traditional way Xiao is supposed to be used, there's also a way to play him outside of that, being Xiao's enabler and driver side. Plunging attacks do not have an internal cooldown, allowing Xiao to apply Anemo and swirl every plunge. And with a Xiao technique known as Jet, which is doing one normal attack and charged attack before jumping back in the air, you can get one swirl from this as well, giving Xiao a swirl from his plunge and one from his Jet. The last thing you then want to do is give Xiao a Favonius Lance, so he's able to battery his teammates, as well as for Verdescent to be able to support. The most popular way to play Xiao like this is on Xiao National or Xiao Shinal, which is Bennett, Zhongli, and an off-field damage dealer of your choice in the last slot. There's also Xiao driving a team core like Double Hydro as well. This is a horrible waste of opportunity cost, as most likely the characters will be able to carry their own respective teams, but at the same time it is just extremely fun and quite competent. Okay, so now moving on to the cryo characters, in the first one. Okay, Aloy. She can be used okay in all the cryo team cores listed previously, but to be completely honest, her best use is to be on a Favonius or Sacrificial Bow, to battery Ayaka or Eula. She actually generates a lot of particles with 1E, so knock yourself out. Okay, so with Chongyun, as more cryo characters have been released, he has sort of lost a lot of relevance. But Chongyun does have some properties unique to him, like being able to give a cryo infusion, so if you're pairing him on a freeze team with someone like Rosaria or Kaeya, they are able to benefit a lot more from normal attacking. Another one of Chongyun's core traits leads into one of the best uses for him, and that is that his elemental burst has no internal cooldown, meaning each one of his swords will apply cryo, meaning they can all be melted. This is why putting Chongyun on a reverse melt team with Zhongli, Rosaria and Bennett is quite effective, as you can consistently quad nuke his E, which just obliterates enemies. And I mean, there is also the niche of making your characters a cryo DPS with Chongyun and Shenhe, but without Shenhe constellations it isn't all that great, to be honest. Chongyun can also be a good slot on the national team core, being able to do some burst DPS as well as enable Zhongli to melt a bit. And as standard, Chongyun also works well on all the cryo team cores mentioned. Moving to our first cryo support, we have Diona, who is all about keeping your team alive with sustained healing and shielding. Diona is one of the best cryo batteries, being able to generate a lot of cryo particles in bulk, as well as the fact that she can be used outside of the normal cryo team cores. Being a shielder, you can slot her on teams for characters like Xiao, Hu Tao, Yoimiya, etc. The only real issue with Diona is that she kind of does negative damage, meaning she isn't a good fit on a team like Reverse Smelt. So yeah, Diona can be used as a flexible defensive option anywhere, and with C6 there are some funky one-shot comps you can set up. Moving on, we have my girl Eula, who was my profile picture, my one of two triple crowns, and my favorite character in the game. Eula is of the hyper carry archetype, but she does deviate from the other cryo damage dealers I will list later, as she's actually a physical damage dealer. Most of what people love about Eula is, well, her backloaded nuclear bomb she's carrying, and learning how to use her backloaded nature effectively for content where it's applicable can give you a lot of ease in clearing some content. Moving on to her teams, as a physical DPS there are two popular cores, the Eula and Fischl core, and the Eula and Raiden core. Eula Fischl teams are comprised of Eula and Fischl of course, and then your third slot will be a cryo battery, notably Rosaria or Diona, and then the last slot can be whatever you really need. If you're using Diona, then your last slot can be Rosaria, if your Eula has energy issues, or another off-field damage dealer like Beidou, Jingqiu, Yulon, etc. But if your third slot is Rosaria, then using a defensive option like Zhongli would be preferred. And then with Eula Raiden, it's basically the same premise. Eula, Raiden, a cryo battery, and then a flex slot depending on your team's needs. The only other thing Eula Raiden opens up is the fact that you can use someone like Lisa, Qiqi, or hell even Yai, who generally have very high burst costs, due to the fact that they would just require way too much energy on a Eula team without Raiden. Deviating away from Eula standard gameplay is Reverse Smelt Eula, Bennett, Zhongli, and Rosaria. It is again a horrible waste of opportunity cost, as Zhongli and Eula would be able to carry their own respective teams, but it does enough damage to somewhat warrant it being here if you don't want to play Eula in a traditional way. In direct contrast to Eula, we have our Coco Goat Ganyu. Ganyu has a good amount of coverage in her team options, allowing her to always reliably be a good damage dealer for almost all content. The two primary ways to play Ganyu are her freeze and melt variants. Starting off with freeze, Ganyu, or more notably called Morgana, it's a team that you'd want to use with Venti preferably, to abuse the quadratic scaling you get from Ganyu's ultimate that ramps up a significant amount for every enemy grouped together in her ultimate's radius up to 5 targets. So you would use Ganyu, Venti, and then a Hydra like Mona or Kokomi, with their cryo slot being Shenhe, Rosaria, Kaeya, or Diona. This team obliterates mobbing content and can even contend quite well against some heavier enemies or the Abyss Lectors and Heralds. You can also replace Venti with Kazuha, in which case you'd be basically relying on Ganyu's other quality, her charge attacks, but at that point you should just run Melt Ganyu. Melt Ganyu uses Ganyu's charge attacks, which not only have high scalings but also no ICD, meaning that with sufficient enough pyro application you are also able to reliably melt all of her charge attacks and blooms. The reason this differs from other reverse melt variants is because of two things. One, because of how vulnerable Ganyu is, a strong shielder like Zhongli is very recommended, and some people even consider him a requirement. Not only that, but because of the other reverse melt comps are quicksort comps, having Ganyu be on field for a prolonged period of time makes the energy requirements for the other teammates go up. The slightly good thing about this though is that Ganyu doesn't really need to burst out all in this team compared to freeze Ganyu, so you can just build full offense in your stats and run a set like 4 Shimenawas. 4 Wanderers also is basically equal to this as well. So let's assume the team is comprised of Ganyu, Bennett, Zhongli, and a Pyro Enabler. This can either be a Pyro unit like Zhangling who also adds her personal damage output, or another Onemo like Jin or Kazuha to reduce resistances. There is also a choice of running double Geo Ganyu relying purely on Ganyu's raw damage boosted by Shenhe, and outside of being a damage dealer you can also easily make Ganyu work as an off-field cryo support for a character like Ayaka. Speaking of Ayaka, we have the other cryo sword user, Kaeya.
Right? Kaeya is better. Okay? Straight up, Kaeya is better.
Kaeya is downplayed a lot despite the fact that he's pretty much used in the same places as Rosaria and could be a one-to-one replacement for her, but also offering more mobility as he isn't locked in place. That's not to say one is better than another, it's just that they should both have their respective place and be held in similar regard. Kaeya can be used effectively in all the cryo cores listed, reverse melt, freeze, etc. On freeze teams, Kaeya is quite notable, especially if you're using a character like Ayaka, because due to Kaeya's Ascension 4, he can drop 2 more clear particles on frozen enemies hit by his elemental skill, lowering your team's overall energy requirements by a lot, allowing for more comfortable rotations. Moving on to Ayaka. Ayaka freeze teams are built up like how any other freeze teams are. Since Ayaka does have a very high burst cost, she wants a well invested cryo battery to complement her, or just Shenhe. And then you want a Hydro character, preferably Kokomi or Mona, and then Venti or Kazuha in the last slot. Ayaka gets amazing utilization of buffs seeing as her damage is front loaded into her burst, so it's recommended to stack a fuck ton of buffs before unleashing it. And moving away from freeze, there's actually an option of using Ayaka in a melt team for a very specific scenario. Ayaka's burst knocks back enemies a lot, so against enemies that can have their stance broken, you just really want to use a freeze team, but against enemies that can't have their stance broken, like bosses for example, you do have the option of running a melt team, and to be completely honest, there's no real principle behind it. The team consists of Ayaka, Bennett, Zhangling, and another cryo character, and both Zhangling and Ayaka will sometimes melt. The team isn't really good because there's a synergy between Ayaka and melt, as Ayaka is gated by a lot of ICDs. It's just that Ayaka buffs by Bennett and a Zhangling on the team just do a lot of raw damage together. On the complete opposite end of raw damage, we have Qiqi, Qiqi's biggest downside is that she's purely a healer. She doesn't even generate that much energy or apply a lot of cryo. So Qiqi can't actually be used on any of the cryo team cores really well, as she has no redeeming qualities in them. The only thing I can really think of is that since Qiqi attacks very fast, she can be used as a good driver for a taser team with Xingqiu, Fischl and Beidou, essentially replacing the Sucrose on standard taser. Qiqi would run a clam set, and she actually can proc superconducts, making her bubble tick more and do a good amount of damage, but that's really it. Qiqi kind of just doesn't do anything else and can be an okay healer if you have a flexible spot on the team. Rosaria is quite similar to Kaeya. She is usable and good on all the cryo team cores like reverse melt, in which she is probably the most relevant cryo for, as she's able to melt everything in her kit, and for freeze teams as a battery or quick swap carry. So you can go back to the beginning and check for more info on the cryo team cores. Rosaria does have some unique traits in being able to be used on physical teams due to her Constellation 6 that shreds physical resistance. And also Rosaria boosts crit by quite a bit, increasing your other damage dealer's consistency. Closing out the cryo characters with the objective hottest character in the game, if you disagree you're delusional, we have Shenhe. Shenhe is basically wherever you slaughtered Kaeya or Rosaria on a team, you just replace them with her and get better results. Shenhe, through her cools and her burst that decreases cryo resistance, and her other buffs from her passives like boosting skill damage, is able to buff cryo damage dealers by a significant amount, at least in single target, as her cools get depleted extremely fast in AoE situations. As with all cryo characters, Shenhe can be used on any of the cryo team cores if you do have a cryo damage dealer alongside her. On reverse mode, the traditional core with Bennett, Rosaria, Shenhe and Zhongli will push Rosaria's cryo damage to its absolute ceiling, and for freeze teams for the premier 5-star DPS, you would want to pair her with his Ayaka, because Shenhe shines more in single target situations than in mobbing content, which Ganyu's freeze team is better in. As stated in the Chongyun section, with Shenhe, you can make almost any character a cryo damage dealer, but what is a better use of Shenhe is to just explode both your Ayaka and Ganyu's damage instead. Mono Cryo is a team with Shenhe at its core, where you'd want to use any two cryo damage dealers in the last 2 slots, but you know Ganyu and Ayaka are just the best slots there if you do have them. The team doesn't really need that much of an explanation, I think. It's just a lot of raw damage going off, drastically reducing the cryo character's energy needs as well. Because you have Ayaka on the team, this does suck against non-boss enemies, but is still competent enough to be worth the mention. Shenhe is also surprisingly a great support to Eula teams, as well as the only real drawback being the energy requirements for both of them, which can be somewhat solved with Raiden. And speaking of Raiden, now that cryo is done, let's go over to Electro. So Beidou's just a ridiculous amount of raw damage in multi-target content, especially so in 2-target scenarios. To give a better explanation, Beidou's ultimate jumps back and forth between targets, so when there is one target, Beidou's discharge will only hit once, as you would think. But when there are multiple targets, Beidou's discharge will do 2 more jumps for 2 more instances of damage, giving 3 hits of her ultimate with 1 discharge. And at Constellation 2, this goes from 3 to 5 instances of damage and 1 discharge, so when building Beidou teams, the only thing you are really thinking about is who can I get to trigger as many Beidou discharges as possible, while also having other teammates to circumvent issues like energy. Starting off with the most commonly run Beidou team, we have Taser Beidou with Xingqiu and Fischl, and then an Onimo in the last slot who is typically Sucrose. One of Beidou's notable issues is that she is tied to an Electro battery, who will generally be Fischl, or if you want to suffer for some reason, Electro MC. But going back to the Fischl, Xingqiu and Beidou core, anyone with fast attacks can work here to drive if you need to save Sucrose for another half. Zhongli, Qiqi, any catalyst user all works pretty well, and some can even add their own utility in from their kit. But if you want to use someone like Kazuha here, you can replace Fischl with Keqing to be able to battery Beidou and drive with Keqing on this team. It is really hard to recommend doing that though, because of the fact that Keqing won't really enable anything like an Onimo or a Hydro driver would, and her animations like her ultimate take up too much time, making you potentially lose Beidou discharges, and to top it off, she can knock lighter enemies away with her charge attacks. Other than that, Beidou can be used on overload teams quite well, as it's just a lot of raw damage. Beidou, Fischl, Bennett and any power unit really, and everything kind of just dies. You can even make someone like Kiyomiya feel like she actually has AoE. And if you want to push your Beidou's damage to the absolute ceiling, you can use a hyper carry Beidou team by just replacing the Para unit here with Kazuha. And lastly, to anyone who plays Genshin for the ships, Ningguang, Beidou, Zhongli and Fischl works well in a team composition called Sucrose. Ningguang has quite good frame data with cancels to proc a lot of discharges with Beidou, as well as adding in her own personal damage buff by Geo Resonance, and the team is also just very comfortable to play. And I mean, you can also use Child with Beidou, but due to Child's downtime it can be very awkward to play and is overall just worse than the other options. Now let's move on to the Mein Fraulein herself, the one and only Prinzessin der Verurteilung, Fischl. If I were to sit here and list everywhere Fischl can be used, it would be way too long. Since Fischl is one of the only Electro characters that isn't heavily dependent on another, you can just go back to the Electro section where I talk about all the Electro team cores, and basically just imagine that as Fischl. Just keep in mind Fischl is basically usable on every single team or character that isn't a cryo damage dealer as the flex slot. Okay, so Keqing does get a lot of shit, which is kind of deserved, but Keqing does have a lot of flexibility within her team options, all of which can perform quite competently. Starting with the Electrocharge Keqing team, there are two cores, one of which is with Xingqiu, normally for more single target oriented content, and the other of which is with Kokomi, which will mostly be an AoE or if you have skill issues. The last slots will be another Electro character and an Onimo, which will most likely be Venti, Kazuha, or even Sayu. Moving on from Electrocharge, we have Keqing Hyper, which is just like Raiden Hyper, but not good. Okay, I'm gonna stop shitting on Keqing now before I actually annoy someone. But it is just a hyper carry team to help push Keqing's damage to the absolute ceiling, comprised of Bennett, Kazuha, and a C6 Sara preferably. The last option for Keqing besides the Electro cores I listed, which you can go look at, is Quickswap Keqing. Using Keqing as a Quickswap unit combined with other Quickswap damage dealers is a potent option for her and alleviates some of her issues with stamina management and her low attack reach. So on the opposite end to Keqing, who is quite flexible, we have Sara, who is really only effectively used with Raiden. Since Sara needs a lot of energy and has low buff uptime, and also doesn't generate that much energy, it is really hard for her to fit in a lot of teams. And even then, Sara really wants to be C6 to be better than a C0 Lisa with Thrilling Tales. Though in Sara's defense, she does have the luxury of being able to frontload a lot of her damage in quite a big AoE. So Sara is really only used with Raiden or Keqing hyper carry teams, but maybe things will change down the line later, but as of now that's really about it. So with Kuki, a lot of her teams are really niche or just teams where she can be side graded quite easily to a Fischl for better results. Until Dendro, Kuki doesn't really have a strong defined role in Genshin's current meta. But for teams where you do want an Electro character like Raiden and Ayato Taser, she works decently there. Since you want to build Kuki with the law of elemental mastery, you can run very fun overload teams with her as well. Kuki works great as a solo Electro, and due to her being a healer, she can be used as a flex slot when you need mitigation on your team. She can also consolidate roles well on a Eula team. Lisa is another character who doesn't seem all that valuable, at least until Dendro comes out. One of Lisa's strongest defining traits is her defense shred, as shredding defenses in Genshin is a rare trait only a few characters have. If she wasn't gated by ridiculously high energy requirements, it would be way easier to sell her. Going over where Lisa can be used as a damage dealer, one of her highest ceiling teams in AoE would be pairing Lisa with Beidou, Venti, and Bennett. Venti lowers both Lisa and Beidou's energy requirements, allowing them to gear into more offensive stats while not being heavily punished. They still need to build a lot of energy, but this does help alleviate it a bit. Lisa, like with all the Electro units, can also be used well on Taser or Electrocharge teams, which is built with the usual Taser core of Fischl, an Onimo unit, and a Hydra unit. Lisa will be the on-field driver of this team, constantly weaving in auto attacks and her E-taps. She also has her Overload teams, which are again niche but really good in AoE. Overload Lisa is built up of Bennett, Zhongli, and an Onamo character that can either be Venti or Kazuha. You really want a pyro-infused burst here, so keep that in mind when playing the team. Then moving on to Lisa as a support, she can be used really well with Raiden, Hypercarry, and Eula teams, with her defense shred often being able to compete with the other slots you can put in those teams. Now we can talk about the better Electro Woman, Her Excellency, the almighty Narukami Ogosho, God of Thunder, Raiden. So Raiden's main gimmick is effectively her energy refund universally to her teammates during her burst up time. Raiden works really well as an enabling DPS for characters like Jingqiu and Zhengling, which is why her national team is very strong, as well as the fact that she can also be a carry on some of her teams. Let's start with Raiden as a hypercarry, as this should be the easiest to get through. Raiden's traditional hypercarry team utilizes Bennett and Kazuha as the core. If you add a Hydro unit here like Yelan or Jingqiu, then you're going through with Raiden's Soup variant, which has a good mix of single target and AoE. Like with all Soup variants, you are applying an electro-charged aura on the enemy, which will be through Raiden and your Hydro unit, and then you use an Onoma unit to infuse their abilities with Pyro, like Kazuha's ultimate, and the Pyro infusion reacts with the Electro and Hydro aura, leading to an overvape reaction. Removing the Hydro and going for other Electro units like Sara and Lisa pushes Raiden's output to its ceiling, making up the traditional Raiden hypercarry team, which is very potent in multi-target content. You can always run Fischl over Lisa and Sara to split the damage distribution between Raiden and Fischl, while also giving you stronger single target damage, which I made a whole video on, which you guys can go check for more of an overview. And again, as with all Electro units, you can always go down the overload route by using Zhongli as your 4th slot. Moving away from Bennett, there are Taser or Electro charged Raiden teams that are built up like all the other Taser team archetypes with a Hydro, Onamo, and then another Electro or Hydro slot. Her Taser teams are somewhat different, as she will be the one driving them, making more off-field units more preferred. You can opt to use double Hydro Raiden for this, or you can go for the Raiden Fischl pairing, opting to use Yelan, Jingqiu, or Kokomi as your Hydro slot, and Sucrose and Kazuha work really well for your Onamo slot. One thing to keep in mind is that for most of Raiden's teams with Kazuha or an Onamo, in general you most likely want to go the opposite element and not an Electro infusion. On Electro charged Raiden, you want to infuse your burst with Hydro, and on Raiden Hyper and Raiden Soup, you want to infuse your burst with Pyro by standing in Bennett's ring. Next up we have Razor, our homeless looking furry. His first team being a physical carry is relatively straightforward. Razor, a cryo character, and then 2 flex slots. Or in Razor language, need ice, no one else matter. But being completely honest, that is very boring. The best theory crafter Heizou, please text me back, popularized self-overload Razor in a lot of meta and theory crafting circles. The team isn't anything necessarily top meta, but it's very fun and can be quite potent. The way it works is that Razor's ultimate, similar to Jean's, acts like a type of cleanse. Razor will constantly apply Electro to himself when there is an element on him and cause a reaction. This doesn't actually deal damage to him though, which is quite interesting, meaning you aren't passively ending him like with Hu Tao or Xiao. And for your 3rd slot, running Jean is quite nice because not only will she be constantly swirling Pyro, if you do decide to go down the self-overload route, you'll be building Razor with as much EM as humanly possible. And because of this, Jean will be swirling Pyro onto the enemy, allowing you to use your skill and react to this and cause more overload damage. And for the last slot, you can choose to run Jingqiu or Yelan for more transformatives, Zhongli, and I've even seen some people run Raiden. So to round out the Electro, we have EEEQEEE, or in actual terms Yaimiko. As with all the Electro carries listed, she has 2 options: Hyper carry with Bennett and Kazuha, or just Taser Slave. Building teams around Yai is about being able to maintain uptime on her turrets, while also being ready to drop a bomb at any time to effortlessly clear some waves. Also, before going further, I just want to talk about how Yai should not be seen as a Fischl replacement, please. Yai takes up too much field time and needs too much energy for her to be a good Fischl replacement, and even assuming you hit her energy requirements, unless you just one rotate everything, then it's still just Yae is best used to carry her own team or run as a dual carry with Raiden. Speaking of which, Yae's team cores are either going to be with Fischl or with Raiden, and one thing for anyone who does plan to main Yae is that depending on your stats, primarily your energy recharge stat, if you have lower ER, so anything below around 140 energy, then you can actually burst every other rotation with Yae instead of trying to force her to burst every rotation when you quite literally don't have the facilities for that. Now to go into more depth, there is Yae Hypercarry, which is drafted with Fischl, Yae Bennett, and then as with most Hypercarry comps you want to use Kazuha here. But Sucrose here as an alternative works really well because of Yae's EM passive. Yae's totems don't actually snapshot, so you don't really have to try and buff them. What you want to pour everything into though is her ultimate. Yae's rotations actually don't use EEE. You want to put some space for the totems before your ultimate, so they are passively doing damage while you go through your other characters. And then when you do set up all of your buffs, like Bennett and Kazuha, go back to Yae and Nuke, reset up her totems and repeat. Now sticking with Fischl, we have Yae's taser teams, which are a lot more flexible. Yae, Fischl, and then any Hydro and Onimo unit work here. Kokomi as the Hydro and Kazuha as your Onimo would be the premium options, but the typical Sucrose and Xingqiu pair still dominates. You can also choose to have Yae as your on-field driver if you want to, but typically Sucrose or Kokomi gain a lot more benefit from being on field, because not only do they have other benefits while being on field like Sucrose's constant swirls and Kokomi's high damage from clam procs, you also don't get bullied by the slightest bit of damage dealt to you. Now let's talk about... time to talk about Geo. With the Prince of Chalk, who has literally negative field time, in a team he is one of the most flexible Geo units, and his core strength is similar to Fischl, in which he can consistently apply off-field damage while being extremely self-sustainable. Albedo can be slotted well in some taser teams, replacing your second Electro, or Overvape and Vape teams, in place of an Onimo unit because of his EM share. This would be typically worse than the Onimo option, but it would help to free them up for another team. Diving into his options, we have the choice of using the Geo Bros duo or the double Geo team with Albedo. Pairing Albedo with Zhongli enables Geo Resonance, which is quite potent, that also buffs Albedo's output as well. And with this being a core with 2 units that have quite little field time, you can even use a hybrid carry and their support in the last 2 slots, like Hu Tao and Xingqiu, Klee and Bennett, Xiao and an Onimo battery, and so on and so on. Though most of the time double Geo won't be the best in slot option, it is still quite comfortable and easy to play, not requiring complicated setups. But if you still want to double, well actually quadruple dip into piss colored physical damage, you can utilize a Geo carry like Itto or Noel, or Ningguang building mono Geo teams, which Albedo is very vital to because of his energy generation and the fact that he contributes a decent bit to the team's output. And on the topic of mono Geo, Arataki Itto, the premier Geo Hypercarry, is defined by the fact that he is able to put out very competitive output without really needing units very valued by other teams. Because... Geo. Due to this, Itto only really has one team, or one team core, and that is Mono Geo, which is just Itto, Gorou, a Geo unit who would preferably be Albedo, and whoever you want in the last slot. This team offers a high consistent DPS flow, while also being very easy to play and manage. And there is no real complicated rotation depending on your last unit. And your last slot can be a lot of characters depending on the Abyss floor, like if for example you need to break Hydro Shields, you could bring a Diona or Rosaria to assist you, and because there are no real elemental reactions going on, Crystallize isn't real, there is no real way for your last slot to really break any of your synergy. Now let's talk about Gorou, my favorite unit. I'm so happy to talk about him. What an interesting, fun and interactive unit he is, coupled with his absolutely amazing design. Itto, Noel and Ningguang Slave. I wish I was joking, but there's nothing really noteworthy to mention at all besides Gorou being the core to Mono Geo teams, which don't get me wrong is great in its own right. It means he's not very competed for, but at the same time it strictly limits his team options, and he's not fun to team build with. So yeah, the furry just holds together Mono Geo. With Ningguang, she's actually a lot different to the other Geo DPS characters like Itto, who we just mentioned, and Noelle, who will be mentioned after this. Ningguang is quite a flexible Geo character, being able to be used as a quickswap DPS due to the fact that most of her damage is loaded into her burst, and she can also be used as an on-field damage dealer and get more benefit from her charge attacks and the jades she creates, which scale really well. Or just throw a TTDS on her to enable double Geo and call it a day. But focusing more on the quickswap teams, they are built around very short rotations, which is manageable because of her low cooldowns. For these teams, you very heavily want another Geo unit. Actually, the core to these teams are Ningguang, Zhongli, and another Geo unit, which would preferably be Albedo, but the Geo main character can work here okay. And then your last slot here would be a flexible option, but you want it to be someone that either has long enough off-field uptime to be able to cast once every other 12-second rotation, or someone who also fits in with the 12-second rotation archetype, which can be someone like Fischl, Sara, and Gorou. And then with the most popular way to play Ningguang, which would be as a sustained damage dealer, this usually revolves around trying to maximize Ning's overall output, and because of that, our favorite boy Bennett is very highly recommended here. And you can also help to buff any attack scaling characters you bring with Ningguang like Fischl or Zhangling. And then in your last slot, you want to bring another Geo unit to help Ningguang burst reliably, in which your best bet is to go with Albedo, as he doesn't need to take up field time in Bennett's ring at all. This way of using Ningguang is very flexible and there are a lot of ways to run it, so I'll just throw some of the notable compositions up on screen because fuck listening. Every gacha game needs one, so let's talk about Genshin's staple maid Noelle, who will take care of all your needs by doing quite literally everything. Healing, shielding, buffing herself, and damage. If only she could generate energy. Due to Noelle's kit being very split, it is recommended that you wait till C6 to actually build her, otherwise artifact optimization just gets way too fucking complicated. To kick things off, Noelle can be used as a shielder if you do need the mitigation, considering you have a trio of strong characters that do enough damage. The only problem with this approach is that the shield won't be active half the time, making it very awkward to want to use her just for the shielding factor. Noelle is intended and only really talked about for her sort of bruiser archetype. She is able to put out good AoE damage while not being able to get staggered or interrupted frequently. Noelle is very dependent on a Geo battery since, zero energy generation, so going from top to bottom we have Noelle with 4 Geo units building up the Mono Geo team. It is the same principle behind Itto's Mono Geo team, just unga bunga till everything dies and make sure you have your shield up for Geo resonance. The team would be built up of Noelle, Gorou, and any 2 Geo units of your choice, and all of them work quite well here with Albedo and Zhongli being the best last picks. Since Noelle is able to swap out of her burst without her burst infusion disappearing, you are very easily able to swap to your supports like Gorou or Yunjin to refresh buffs and generate energy for Noelle, lowering her energy requirement, which is a luxury not many hypercarries have. And then if we just get rid of a Geo from the team, we have something that plays out relatively the same, as you can just use a flexible slot depending on what your team needs, whether that's a Pyro to break shields, Fischl or Jingshou for single target damage, etc. Just keep in mind that if you're running 3 Geo units, you really want to keep Gorou on the team, unless you decide to just get rid of another Geo unit, in which case it would be Gorou, as he doesn't benefit much from only 2 Geo characters, and someone like Albedo, Zhongli, or Geo MC will offer more to Noelle. Again, with 2 Geo units, it doesn't really change Noelle's playstyle much, you just have the option of running team cores like Double Hydro or Fischl Beidou. Now for Yunjin, her place in team building is relatively straightforward, seeing as she is just a niche support. Yunjin wants to be run with characters that dish out a lot of normal attacks to gain benefit from her additive buff. The only problem with that is that there aren't really that many normal attackers in Genshin, and even with the ones we have, most normal attackers are better off with someone else. Yunjin's best pairing will be with Yoimiya, with her pairing with Hu Tao, Ningguang, Ayato, Razor, and Noelle not being bad options either. And because Zhongli is able to attack very fast and proc Yunjin a lot, running him as a physical carry with Crescent Pike and Yunjin to support isn't a horrible option, but more so for fun than anything else. Ironic that we will be ending on the Geo Archon himself, but The most practical and most recommended is to just use him as a shield bot, stack HP artifacts on him and use him only primarily for his shield, And you can also throw a Favonius weapon on him to help with energy generation, which will most likely require a crit rate circlet. There isn't really anything complicated behind it. Just slot him in a team where you have 3 characters that either have enough output like double Hydro Hu-Tao, or teams that require his shield to be practical. I'm looking at all the Yoimiya and Melt Ganyu players. I know your ass can dodge, but if you find the shielding route too boring, you can lead into building damage for possibly the slowest animation in the game and go for burst DPS Zhongli, where you try to maximize his burst damage. Nothing really changes here within his team options, except for the fact that if you go down this route, you really want to be playing a double Geo team to help Zhongli's energy generation and the buff he gets from Geo Resonance. And moving on from that, we have Microwave Zhongli. Who the fuck comes up with these names? Regardless, Microwave Zhongli is a team that capitalizes on the Geo damage and resonating Geo damage from Zhongli's pillars, which is why for this team core you really want to use Geo MC, as he has long-lasting constructs which don't tax the construct limit heavily. So with Zhongli and Geo MC out of the way, there are some ways you can branch out. Either by adding Albedo to your team who adds more resonates with his own personal contribution, or you can add in our favorite Bennett and pair him with another off-field damage dealer like Zhangling or Fischl for their own contribution. The Microwave duo can also be used in tangent with hyper carries like Xiao and Itto as well. And lastly, there is one other way to use your Geo Archon, and Pai Klee or physical Zhongli is a somewhat competent use for him. Zhongli has very rapid and fluid attacks, meaning that he can abuse the Crescent Pike passive quite well. And not only that, but this makes him quite an excellent driver for the double Hydro core, while also reducing the resistance of the element he drives, so you can use him for taser teams as well. And that will close at Geo. Starting off with what should be most people's first Hydro unit, Barbara. So with Barbara and most other Hydro characters, they will most notably be played in team comps or archetypes that will want to utilize the way they apply Hydro. Unfortunately, in her case, she applies very little Hydro, meaning that as a support she can only be used as a sort of cope taser driver and enabler, and then she can also be used on freeze and carry Thrilling Tales. Like with some shielders, you can also decide to use her as a flexible healer slot if you already have 3 strong characters, but keep in mind that even though Barbara applies a very infrequent amount of Hydro, she can still mess up some elemental reactions with the little she applies, so keep that in mind unless more Hydro is a plus for you. And fuck it, I'll cover DPS Barbara. Ocean Hued Clam ignores defense but doesn't ignore resistances. Ocean Hued Clam does a physical hit, meaning with things like Superconduct and C6 Rosaria, you are able to boost the damage from the Clam set by reducing physical resistance. So yes, going back to Barbara as a Beidou driver, one team you can run which is fun is a sort of taser team that tries to maximize the Clam set damage. And then for using Barbara as a Hydro DPS, first of all, why? But second, it would use Bennett and a really fast Pyro applicator which can only really be Zhangling or Jean. And then your last lot can be a Shielder or a Kazuha or Sucrose. Now onto the worst Kamisato sibling. Ayato specializes and is very valued in team building just because of how many team archetypes he can fit into. With his freeze team in which he would replace Kokomi or Mona, freeze only needs AoE Hydra application, which Ayato can do with his burst. So you run him on Blizzard or Emblem with the Fav Sword to Battery, running mainly Ayaka and Ganyu as burst DPS who Q and swap. He doesn't provide any strong buffs like Mona or Kokomi, but he can provide his own personal damage which can be especially strong in AoE when he and Ganyu scale quadratically. Then moving on to Vaporize Ayato, he can't really forward Vaporize all that well due to the fact that he will not only eat up the Pyro aura instantly when he applies Hydro, but also due to his internal cooldown on his infused auto attacks. Even when trying to maximize Pyro application with both Zhangling and Sunfire, he will more than not just not apply Hydro to even Vaporize. So in practice it would actually be better for him to enable Vaporize for our Pyro Overload Zhangling, in which you would build up Ayato, Bennett and Zhangling. Your last slots here would preferably be a Sucrose or Fischl. Kazuha here can be used, but because of Ayato's ultimate, it is very hard to consistently double swirl if at all. So your best bet is to use Sucrose, who can guarantee both a Hydra and Pyro swirl by using the Gorou swirl mechanic inside Ayato's burst. And then Fischl here is not only the best option for single target, but also helps to sustain Vaporize with Ayato somewhat. Moving on to Electrocharged Ayato or his taser teams, there are quite a few options to go for. His taser core is built up with Fischl and Kazuha, with Kazuha being replaceable by someone like Venti in mobbing or multi-wave content, to where Venti's grouping is more important. And from this, you can either go the double Hydra route, which will utilize Xiao or Yelan for extremely strong single target output, or the double Electro route using characters like Beidou or EEEQEEE. Both team archetypes are quite similar in effectiveness in the right content, so lean towards and build whatever you like more. And from Ayato's Taser core, we also have Ayato's Soup teams, which is just the standard Soup archetype, using Ayato as the Hydra unit. This time though, the characters aren't really all that malleable, as the team is composed of Ayato, Bennett, Fischl, and Kazuha, and it's really hard to replace any of them without heavy drawback. This team shines in multi-target content and just feels very fluid to play. And finally, Hypercarry Ayato. I would advise you not to go down this route unless your Ayato was very well invested into, as this does tend to perform worse than Ayato's other teams, kind of because Yunjin is Geo. Ayato is a Hydra unit who can enable and trigger 3 strong reactions. Even though adding in Yunjin boosts Ayato's damage, for overall team damage you are better off bringing another element Ayato interacts well with. Okay, Mona. She is very weird. Mona is an amplifying character who makes her teammates do more damage, so with using her as a support, one of the best ways to do so is simply by giving her a TTDS, lots of energy, and pairing her with Kazuha or Sucrose and Bennett to build up the typical one-shot comps. For abyss floors where there is only one wave of enemies that you can group and either one-shot or one-rotate, this can be a somewhat viable strategy to help you clear, but outside of showcases it really isn't all that recommended, because if you fail to do the thing the one-shot comp is meant to do. Anyways, outside of one-shot teams, Mona doesn't really have that many teams where she really shines in besides freeze teams, where she can utilize a mechanic called Omen Extension. Mona's ultimate bubble when applied to an enemy lasts up to 8 seconds if you don't touch it, because you need consent of course. And after you pop it or it expires, depending on your talent level, the Omen the bubble leaves lasts around 4 to 5 seconds. If you aren't playing Mona on a freeze team, this bubble will most of the time just pop instantly, leaving you with barely any uptime on the damage bonus. Also keep in mind, Mona's bubble doesn't actually pop when you do damage to an enemy, it pops when you do poise, or for simpler terms, stagger damage to an enemy. All attacks in Genshin have a stagger damage value, and Genshin enemies all have slight resistance to stagger damage. When you deal enough of this stagger damage to them, you break their poise, and that pops Mona's bubble. When enemies are frozen, they become completely resistant to stagger damage, making it impossible to break their poise, giving you the full 13 seconds of her damage bonus, which is why she will usually just occupy the Hydra slot in her freeze team well. You can use her outside of freeze, where she will take up the Hydra slot on the Hydra team cores I mentioned, but I wouldn't really recommend it because of her slow Hydra application. Yep, Kokomi is also kind of weird but slightly less weird than Mona. Kokomi's defining trait is her long-lasting AoE off-field Hydra application that can work to enable some teams, the most notable one being freeze teams, which I don't think requires that much of an explanation. She carries Thrilling Tales, Tenacity, and uses the Hydra slot on the freeze team core. And because Kokomi is also a healer, if you had skill issue before and had to run Diona on freeze for mitigation, you can now run Kokomi and another cryo off-field damage dealer like Rosaria or Kaeya instead. Outside of the freeze archetype, Kokomi works surprisingly well on taser teams, replacing Qiqi. Kokomi, also being a catalyst user, can be a driver and enabler for Hydra reactions. What this does is that if you were using Sucrose on taser teams to drive, you can now sub her in for Kazuha. And on these teams, since Kokomi is going to be on field, you really want to use the clam set, as she adds a lot of damage to the team with these clam set procs. And sticking on the note of Electro Charge, we can play the cancer of Genshin teams, Hell on Earth itself, Sukokomon. Sukokomon is a team of Sucrose, Zhongli, Fischl, and Kokomi. This was the first soup team in my memory to be popularized. As explained with the Goba swirl mechanic, Goba allows you to swirl a pyro aura onto enemies, even when not affected by pyro. So with Kokomi and Fischl, you can apply Electro Charge to an enemy, and then use Sucrose to swirl all 3 elements together for the Overvape swirl. And after you've Goba swirled, you want to switch to Zhongli, use her burst, and then go back to Kokomi to apply Hydra for Zhangling's ultimate to vape. I can't really play this team well, and it is very hard to pull off, but if you manage to pull off the rotation to this team constantly, you get a very strong team. And if you want another AIDS team to play in single target with Kokomi, you can run Fischl National. This team allows Kokomi to again be a Hydro enabler for Zhongli, while also having Bennett on the team to lower energy requirements and allow Zhongli to snapshot. And the last slow of the team here would be Fischl, allowing for overvape reactions and more single target damage. This team is surprisingly competitive and can also maintain a Hydro aura on the enemy in single target, allowing Zhongli to vaporize the majority of her hits. The main utility of this team comes from it being able to free up an Onamo unit and Jingcho for another team, and it also kind of just has 2 healers, so if you somehow manage to die on this team, I don't know what to say. And lastly is the Mono Hydro team. Using the Bowl Cuts and Kazuha, Kokomi holds a clamps on this team while driving both Yelan and Jingcho's elemental bursts or field, while also putting out quite high output of her own, and Kazuha helps by buffing all of their damage. This team yields quite good output while also being very comfortable to pilot because it's an on-field Kokomi team. The only real downside here is how expensive it is, as it does take 3 5-stars and can also hurt your second team due to the fact that it takes up Kazuha and some of the most valuable Hydro characters. It also does have the fallback of being a mono element team, meaning it may have some inflexibility in enemy matchups. For example, if there's an enemy like Mirror Maiden who can heavily resist Hydro. So I love how we go from Kokomi, who has many teams, to Child, who kind of just has one team, but the one team Child is good in happens to be just one of, if not the strongest team in the game currently. International, comprised of Child, Bennett, Zhongli, and primarily an Onamo unit who you want to be Sucrose or Kazuha. Sucrose allows you to frontload Child's nuke from his ultimate while also giving you easy access to double swirl setups, as Goba Swirl is a guarantee if set up properly. And Kazuha adds his own off-field damage and grouping that is more favourable than the way Sucrose groups, and even though double swirl setups aren't guaranteed, they are a lot more flexible than Sucrose on International, and if you really want to, you can replace the Onamo slot with someone like Zhongli if you want the comfort, but it is really hard to recommend doing that. Child also does have his Electro Charge team which works fine, and his freeze team with Ganyu for perma-freeze, which again also works fine, but it's really hard to recommend running Child on a team that isn't International, just because of how much of a cut it is above the rest of his teams. Okay, this is not going to be fun, and you know what, I'm just going to cover Yelan and Jingcho at the same time, because they can essentially be used as a one-to-one for each other on almost every team. Let's start with Vaporized comps. So this is going to be very awkward, as it's basically just going to be going over everything I listed in the beginning when talking about Pyro teams. But essentially most of, if not all, Pyro damage dealers, with the exception of Klee, Jinyan, and Amber, really want to vaporize and chain reverse vaporize reactions to increase their output. So with the Yelan or Jingcho, standard vaporize teams will be Bennett, the pyro damage dealer, and then your last slot can either be an Onamo unit like Sucrose or Kazuha, which is the most recommended, or Fischl in single target situations for over vaporized comps. Or you just run Yelan and Jingcho together for double hydro vaporize teams. Also, before I really go on to talk about Yelan and Jingcho more, one technique you really want to learn on them is something called weaving. Since their burst will only proc on normal attacks, what you want to do to maximize the damage they deal, and if you have Jingcho constantly proc a C6, is to simply just normal attack before every action done. So let's say you're using Yunfei Vaporize. Your rotation starts with you using Jingcho's Q, then you go to Kazuha, use his elemental burst to infuse it with Hydro, and then go to Bennett, Q, and E afterwards to completely remove the Hydro aura and apply Pyro to Swirl, allowing for the double swirl setup to be complete. And then I switch to Yunfei. As you can see, before every action I do, I am constantly normal attacking to maximize the damage Jingcho does. This is also why Yelan and Jingcho are either the first or second in a rotation on most teams. Moving away from vaporized teams, we have taser teams, and of course you have 2 ways to go about it. Either with 1 Hydro and 2 Electro units with 1 Onamo, or double Hydro Taser, which yields extremely high single target damage that will either use Fischl or Raiden as its Electro unit. Both of these work well depending on the specific scenario. In single target, double Hydro Taser is a lot more favored, and in AoE content, then double Electro will be a lot more favored, seeing as Yaya and Beidou are used here to dish out a lot of AoE damage. And actually, one thing to note here is that using Yelan as a driver for double Hydro Taser and using her as an on-field damage dealer isn't that bad of an option. Not only will this lower her energy requirement as she is catching a lot more particles, but she also gets to benefit from her Ascension passive. The typical on-field Yelan team is Yelan, Kazuha, Jingcho, and Fischl, and it yields a ridiculous amount of single target output. Now to close off the reactions, we have freeze teams. Okay, both Yelan and Jingcho can be used on freeze teams, and assuming you weave in a lot of attacks with someone like Ganyu, it can work okay, but generally if you're using Yelan or Jingcho as a solo Hydro in freeze teams with Ganyu or Ayaka, it really isn't that good, as Ganyu and Ayaka would both prefer AoE Hydro applicators that they don't have to normal attack frequently for. But on the other hand, we have Kaeya and Rosaria, who are on quickswap freeze teams alternating between the two. Having Jingcho and Yelan be there is actually somewhat of a benefit, as you will constantly be weaving in normal attacks regardless. Now I wish I could stop talking about them here and move on to Pyro, but no, there is still a bit more to cover. We can now talk about the double Hydro core. Both Yelan and Jingcho complement each other by being able to lower each other's energy requirements, allowing you to use more offensive weapons depending on the team. But you still might want to keep one of them on a Favonius weapon. And I don't think I really have the time or facilities to list all of the team options, but normally it would be a Pyro damage dealer and a Bennett, or a Pyro damage dealer and Zhongli. Hell, you can even use double Hydro for electric carries, geo carries, freeze carries. Fuck it, triple down, use 3 Hydro units on a team, and it still does a fuck ton of damage. I hate this. Let's talk about Pyro units now. Let's kick it off with the character that has been here since the very start, Amber. So until Yelan came out, Amber had a very staple place in one team, which Yelan kind of just denied. So let's talk about Amber as a Pyro support. For a character like Hu Tao, there wasn't really anyone besides Bennett that you could use in the last lot of her team to be able to give her 4 Verdescent, which is why a lot of people played her on a double Geo team. I can't really track or pinpoint who exactly, but someone thought of using Amber to enable a Pyro sword for Hu Tao, as she could carry the elegy bow, buffing Hu Tao even further. So Hu Tao VV Vape, at least the traditional version of it, used Hu Tao, Amber, Jingcho, and Kazuha or Sucrose. It does require Amber to have an elegy bow, but assuming you do, this was one of the only ways to reach Hu Tao's ceiling, giving access to Pyro resistant shreds and the Onimo character buffs. And outside of that, there is nothing really that solidifies Amber as anything meta defining. You can run her on a forward melt team and utilize her charge shots, but please do not torture yourself and do that. Yeah, we were going to get to this eventually. Bennett. Widely regarded to be the best character in the game, holding together a lot of teams, and being such a strong unit that when a unit isn't reliant on Bennett, it is a positive to the character. Bennett is him. He is valued a lot in team building because the attack boost you get from his ultimate is second to none, and gives so much stats to a character that can even more than double their damage. His buff is also able to be snapshotted by certain abilities, meaning that a character like Zhongli can take all the attack Bennett gave to her and walk out of his ultimate and still get his buff. There are quite a few abilities that can be snapshot. Knowing what it does can help out your rotations and increase the amount of damage your team does. Bennett also happens to be able to generate an illegal amount of Pyro energy, helping some of your Pyro characters build into more offensive stats, as well as the fact that Bennett also heals you, on top of this making him consolidate a lot of roles, and he also happens to do a lot of damage because why not? Okay, and I know I said I would cover all teams and all team cores that are relevant, but there is no way, literally no way, I can cover all of Bennett teams as a support. I'll instead just make a tier list of all the characters that really want to Bennett for the teams and don't want him that much. Also, yes, Bennett is a flexible support. You can use him almost anywhere and he'll provide a lot of value. You can also use Bennett as an on-field damage dealer and use one of these two teams, Melt Bennett or Thundering Fury Bennett. Let's cover the latter first. Thundering Fury Bennett is a team that utilizes, well, I think you can guess, the Thundering Fury set. Bennett proccing overloads will reduce his skill cooldown in tandem with his Ascension passive, which also reduces his skill cooldown to a point where he can continuously spam it, and not only does this chain a lot of transformative reactions together, this also generates a lot of energy which lowers the rest of your team's energy needs. As always, because of the constant overloads, you can only really use this against heavier enemies and bosses. The core of this team is Bennett and Jingcho, with an Electro unit and then either another Electro unit or someone who provides some sort of utility. A variation of this team can be something like Bennett, Jingcho, Fischl and Beidou, or you can replace either of the two Electro units here with someone like Lisa. The team is basically really just about spamming Bennett's skill as much as humanly possible. And closing out Bennett teams, which is a word I never thought I would say, Melt Bennett. This team uses Chongyun's ability to give a teammate a cryo infusion, alongside Bennett's low E cooldown that has no ICD, to create an actual well-functioning forward melt team. It uses Bennett, Chongyun, an Anemo unit and another cryo unit as its core. You weave in normal attacks and elemental skills with other characters while being able to switch back to Bennett when his E cooldown is done. With this team, it's kind of just funny to see Bennett do 50k elemental skills every 4 seconds. So TLDR, Bennett can be used almost everywhere. So this is going to be a trend with a lot of the pyro characters we cover from now on, and that is outside of Reverse Vaporize, there really isn't all that much for them. As I listed in the pyro team cores at the beginning, Diluc can be slotted in all the Vaporize archetypes as a pyro damage dealer, and that's kind of really it. There is also Forward Melt Diluc, which replaces your Hydra applicator with a cryo unit like Rosaria and Kaeya, and also relies heavily on your Anemo unit to infuse cryo with their burst. The team is quite hard to pull off consistently though, so sticking with Reverse Vaporize would be ideal. Now doing a complete 180, we have Hu Tao. This is going to be so much fun. Hu Tao is also very heavily tied to Vaporize teams, but unlike the other pyro carries on this list, Hu Tao doesn't heavily rely on Bennett to do a lot of damage. Kicking off with something relatively easy to explain, Double Geo Hu Tao. This team is really to give Hu Tao the Geo Resonance bonus, which benefits her quite a bit. The cutting board is supported by Xingqiu or Yelan, and 2 Geo units, which will most likely be Zhongli and Albedo, but if you don't have one of them, it actually isn't as bad of a replacement to use Yunjin in one of their places. And you can also use Ningguang with a 4 instructor set in place of one of the Geo units. I would at least recommend having one of the premium 5-star Geo units to do this team though. Now onto something slightly more complicated but still relatively simple, we have Vape Melt. So again, this team would use Xingqiu or Yelan and then 2 cryo units. Since as I said before, it's very hard to actually forward melt consistently with a pyro carry, this team opts to melt every other charge attack Hu Tao does, which is why Xingqiu or Yelan would still be there to vaporize the hits that don't melt. An example of this team would be something like Hu Tao, Xingqiu, Rosaria and Diona. And now, talking about overvape, which should be somewhat self-explanatory, it uses Fischl, Xingqiu and a choice of Beidou, Zhongli or Bennett for your last team slot. It just capitalizes on the fact that Hu Tao is able to overload and vaporize the same hit of her charge attacks. And now finally onto arguably Hu Tao's best team core, now we have Double Hydra Hu Tao. And thank fuck, it's a very high damage Hu Tao team that's also relatively simple. Hu Tao, Yelan, Xingqiu, and then you have 4 options for your last team slot. Zhongli can be used here for comfort, and one thing to note is that Zhongli is actually relative to the other options, while also being the most comfortable, making him the most preferred here. And then you can also put Fischl here, making Hu Tao again do overvape reactions and adding in Fischl's own personal damage. If you want to go down another off-field damaging route, you can also use Zhangling here, with the only real issue being that she has a really high energy requirement, but she does make up for it by adding in her own personal damage. And because you have 2 consistent sources of fast Hydra application, you are able to vaporize all of Hu Tao and all of Zhangling's kits that apply pyro. And lastly, you can also use Kazuha. Kazuha can't really double swirl on this team, so he only really swirls Hydra to increase Yelan and Xingqiu's output. He does somewhat make up for it by giving this team AoE damage and also giving access to strong grouping. Speaking of Kazuha, we have Viridescent Hu Tao. Viridescent Hu Tao teams are a lot more complicated than the standard ones for quite a number of reasons. One of which is because Hu Tao doesn't actually need Bennett for a competitive team, so most of the time you're better off not running him. And because of how Hu Tao works and how long her cooldown is, it's very hard for her to apply Pyro for the Anemo unit to swirl and enable for Viridescent, which is why you'd need to look for external Pyro application. The Hu Tao Viridescent core is Hu Tao, Xingqiu or Yelan, Kazuha or Sucrose, and a Pyro unit. Both Toma and Yanfei, when she is C4, can work to not only apply Hydra for Hu Tao, but also give her a shield for more comfort. Then there is also the choice of using Amber on this team to apply Pyro, as she enables really easy double swirl setups, as well as the fact that she can also hold the Elegy of the End weapon, which is a really good bonus to Hu Tao. And lastly, even though I said Hu Tao doesn't really need to use Bennett, she still works surprisingly well with him, meaning it's not a bad option either. And we are finally fucking over. Moving on. And here we have everyone's favorite terrorist, Klee, and when she isn't blasting fish, she's fucking obliterating enemies. Unlike the other pyro carries, Klee is unique as her raw pyro damage without vaporize is very high. And also on the note of vaporize comps, the reason why I wouldn't really recommend using Klee for vaporize is because Klee applies so much pyro that she tends to actually overtake the Hydro aura and then make your off-field Hydro applicators vaporize. This also doesn't really change much either with double Hydro, besides the fact that you can guarantee that at least your charge attacks from Klee will vaporize, which have the highest multiplier. So even though it's still good because both Klee and your off-field damage dealers do quite a bit of damage, there are more options that I would rather recommend. One of which is Klee's staple team, Mono Pyro, and yes, this is also quite straightforward. Klee, Bennett, and Onamo unit, which is preferably Kazuha, and then the choice of Zhongli or another Onamo unit like Venti in the last slot. Mono Pyro is a team that capitalizes on Klee's raw non-reaction damage, while also taking advantage of her AoE, which vaporized teams seeing as Yelan and Jingcho are single target applicators doesn't really give much benefit to. Using a vape team with Yelan and Jingcho can have some benefits, like allowing Klee to save stamina while Yelan uses her skill in addition to her damage bonus, as well as freeing up Kazuha, but it still feels really hard to justify. As mentioned before, Klee applies a lot of pyro, so another way to use her is as a pyro enabler for a character like Rosaria, who has no ICD on her ultimate. Klee, Bennett, Rosaria, and then a flex unit of your choice, whether that's an Onamo unit or another Cryo unit, builds up Klee reverse melt teams. The only problem with running this over reverse melt quickswap teams is that since Klee takes up a lot of field time, she hurts Rosaria's energy requirements, making Rosaria have to build more energy, which can make the team feel not that great. Though a positive over using it over a team like Klee Mono Pyro is that the damage source is now split evenly between Klee and Rosaria, making it a lot more versatile. Besides those two teams, Klee can be used really well on overload teams, since who applies and who triggers isn't very important, and Klee having a lot of AoE on her attacks helps with this. The core of this team would be Klee, Bennett, and Fischl, with two main options. Either you can decide to use Beidou, who just helps to add in her own contribution, as well as enabling Klee to overload a lot more. The biggest issue with Beidou, however, is that Klee attacks quite slow, meaning that you lose quite a lot of discharges on Beidou, griefing Beidou's damage potential. So yeah, Klee and Beidou don't really have that strong of a synergy. There is a choice of using a character like Kazuha to increase the damage of both Klee and Fischl, as well as set up more reactions and give this team stronger grouping. In general, Klee will be doing the most overloads on the team normally, and even then, since she just has so many attacks that don't trigger overload, you still want to build her on attack and not elemental mastery. Thomas. Toma is a pyro shielder that offers quite a potent shield that can help to mitigate damage. He can be used as a flex slot for teams that need a shielder, with the only problem being 1, it has to be a team that does quite frequent normal attacks, otherwise you aren't stacking Toma's shield, so you aren't really benefiting from it, and 2, it has to be a team that doesn't mind some pyro application. Toma applies some pyro, so he has the tendency to potentially mess up reactions. Moving on to team cores, Toma can be used with pyro carries like Yoimiya, who really wants a shield, and Hu Tao. He offers pyro resonance and generates energy for them, allowing them to burst more often. Toma as a support is still really weird because there are just better options to use over him a lot of the time, but he still seems to function well for Tao and Yoimiya. So, if you don't want your Toma to be a support, and you want him to actually be somewhat of a carry, you can opt to use Toma over Vape. Toma Fischl with the Hydro Enabler and Onamo Driver makes an overvape team that gets benefit from Toma overloading and vaporizing the electrocharged aura. Toma here is built with a lot of elemental mastery to capitalize on his reaction damage. This team works simply by applying Electro and Hydro to an enemy, and then Toma every so often will react with this aura, overloading and vaporizing it. In terms of how strong this team is, it works okay. It's also quite fun though, which gives it some points. all praise the overlord of Genshin and team building, Zhongli. So in team building, Zhongli is quite dominant and many regard her to be the best damage dealer in the game due to a number of reasons. Her Pyronado, which is a massive majority of her damage, can snapshot a lot of buffs like attack from sources like Bennett and Thrilling Tales, and elemental mastery from Sucrose, meaning you can get full benefit from a lot of buffs, allowing you to not have to constantly worry about buff uptime or standing in certain zones. On top of this, her Pyronado has no ICD, meaning that as long as you have sufficient enough Hydra application, you will be able to vaporize every single swing of her Pyronado. And top this off with the fact that she does all of her damage off field, meaning that you can run a dedicated on-field unit and run dual carry teams, or run an on-field enabler to help Zhongli do more reactions. So to kick things off, the national team core, which also takes Xiao and Bennett. And typically the best options to slot here are Sucrose, Raiden, Kazuha, and Eula. The principle behind most national teams is to allow Zhongli to vaporize everything, which Xiao enables especially at C6. And then add someone who can amplify Zhongli's damage by a lot, while also being able to swap to Bennett to funnel energy into her, and that's why I can confidently say that you can take the entire cast of Genshin characters, slot them into the national team core, and it will be a dominant team. Hell, fuck a fourth character, just Zhongli, Bennett, and Qiqi as a trio, assuming decent investment will most likely be able to moderately clear most content if not all. So adding in anyone here who can hold a Favonius weapon to lower Zhongli and Qiqi's energy needs, or someone capable of buffing Zhongli will just make the team even stronger. And on the national team, there's also the option of removing Qiqi and replacing him with Child for the international team core. I already went ahead and covered that in Child section, so you can go back and look at it there. And outside of that, you can just run the Bennett and Zhongli duo and use an on-field unit and a support. Zhongli is also the best pyro enabler in the game because of her wide pyro application, coupled in with her own personal damage output, making her a very valued option for a team like Reverse Melt, where she helps set up melt reactions for the cryo damage dealers. And lastly, Zhongli also works well in overload teams, being able to enable and trigger many overloads, while also just having her raw damage there. Zhongli's only real drawback is that she's quite restricted to Bennett, but the thing is that she's simply so good with Bennett that it isn't even that big of a flaw. Hoyoverse may have forgotten about you, but I won't. Xinyan, similar to Toma, is a pyro shielder. The only difference this time is that Xinyan's shield is made out of paper. It is really bad, so it's never really worth using it for strong mitigation. On top of this, the pyro application from the shield is quite awkward and doesn't really do much, so it's not that great at enabling either. Xinyan has three main teams. Starting with her as a physical damage dealer, Xinyan would want a cryo and electro unit to enable superconduct, and then the fourth slot is ideally either Zhongli, because the way Xinyan is played as a damage dealer is by spinning a lot, and Zhongli aids her in not being able to be staggered through this. Or you can just bring Bennett to increase her damage by quite a lot, also lowering her energy requirements. This team is really just apply superconduct and your buffs, and then like a Beyblade just let it rip. And when Xinyan is not a physical carry, she can be a physical carry support, helping to do the damage she could only dream of. Eula, Xinyan, Lisa, and Bennett make up the Eula one-shot teams, which can clear floors where there's only one wave, and also to just showcase your Eula's damage. After setting up all of Eula's buffs, right before the Lightful Sword explodes, with the correct timing, switch to Xinyan and use her skill to increase physical damage, and with her C4 unlocked, reduce physical resistance. Finally, the last real place you can use Xinyan on is Monopyro. This also makes it seem like Xinyan is doing all the work when it's really Zhongli. Xinyan is built as a pyro damage dealer on this team with a C6 Bennett. She really isn't doing much here besides lowering the energy requirement, but again it makes it feel like she's doing something, which is all that counts. Yanfei is another pyro damage dealer that will generally want to capitalize on Vaporize. There's nothing really stand out about her vape teams other than the fact that it has a long range. It is still built up the same way the rest of them are. Yanfei, Bennett, Qiqi, or Eula, and your choice of the Vaporize subcores as listed at the start of the video. Yanfei also works really well on overload teams with Beidou, as she's able to drive Beidou at a distance quite comfortably, and with Fischl's Ascension 4 passive, Yanfei is actually able to be the trigger of overload a majority of the time, making it actually worth to run full elemental mastery, but keeping her on a standard crit build is in some cases going to be better or more preferred, especially if you're using Bennett. And then outside of those two options, you can always run Shield Fae when you have a C4 Yanfei, who can be used for teams like Melt Ganyu, Verdescent Hu Tao, and Yoimiya teams. The only real restriction is that Yanfei will need upwards of like 250 energy, so you're almost glued to running a Favonius Codex or Prototype Amber, which can double in effectiveness by being able to heal your teammates as well. And now, to finally close this off, I honestly have never been so happy to say her name, but Yoimiya. Yoimiya is another on-field damage dealer that takes some of the best traits of a character like Klee because of her good raw damage, and some of the best traits of Zhongli being her flexibility, giving her a wide access to team options. Yoi is actually not very reliant on Vaporize to yield good damage, but if you do want to go down her Vaporize route, Yoimiya, Bennett, Xingqiu, or Yolan, and this is where it gets somewhat tricky. Yoimiya, especially so on a Vaporize team, really wants a shielder, as otherwise you mess up her ICD alignment through things like dodging, waiting, or getting staggered, and this will result in you vaporizing weaker hits. So the last slot of a vaporized Yoi team will preferably be a Zhongli, Thoma, Diona, or any shielder really. Also, one thing to note is that Yunjin will actually be able to replace Bennett completely in Yoimiya teams if you need him somewhere else, or you could just run them together, which actually moves me on to talk about Yoimiya mix and match teams. Similar to Xiao, Yoimiya just has so many options that's basically a team archetype in itself. Without even needing strong synergy, Yoimiya can utilize any of the characters on screen in any combination and give out a good team. There are things like double Hydro Yoimiya, pure Pyro Yoimiya teams, Overload Yoimiya teams, Overvape Yoimiya teams, and the list goes on. So go ahead and utilize any of the combinations of characters on screen. And that closes out the theory into building all the characters. Fuck me. And now, as promised, I'll touch a bit on Dendro and its reactions. Let's start with Quicken as it's the most straightforward. Applying Dendro on Electro will do the Quicken reaction, and what Quicken will do is leave the enemy in a quickened state and gives them a quickened aura for around 10 seconds. Being quickened is a status effect similar to something like Freeze, where it leaves the enemy in that state. Unlike Freeze, however, reacting with the Quicken aura with either Electro or Dendro will give two different unique sub-reactions from the Quicken aura. Also, keep in mind that the Quicken aura acts like a normal Dendro aura, so it reacts with the Pyro and Hydro aura normally, but using Electro gives you Aggravate, which is extra Electro damage that can be multiplied by your crit ratios and damage bonuses. And then it's basically added onto the hit that you were going to do. So let's say you have Fischl and she does 100 Electro damage, but then you use Fischl on a quickened enemy, and then let's say that the quickened damage does 20 damage. That 20 damage is then added onto your Fischl's 100 Electro damage, giving you now 120 damage overall instead of 100. But the great thing about Quicken is that when you use Electro on it, the Quicken aura doesn't actually disappear. Meaning that if you keep hitting the Quicken aura with Electro, it will keep adding on the Aggravate damage to your damage until the Quicken aura naturally decays. But the caveat to this is that Aggravate will only happen on a hit that not only does Electro damage, but also applies Electro. So it will be gated by your Electro character's internal cooldowns. And then Spread works the exact same way that Aggravate does, but it does slightly more base damage, and is when Dendro is applied to the Quicken aura. Because Fischl's Ascension 4 has no ICD, Aggravate teams will most likely use Fischl as the core to them, with either an Electro driver like Keqing or Yai, or an Onamo driver in AoE, as Electro swirls will trigger Aggravate, meaning Sucrose can be used. For Spread teams, since Spread isn't an Electro reaction and won't proc Fischl's A4, and with the Dendro characters you have currently besides Tainari teams, I really don't see pure Spread teams being that great. Now Burning. Burning is the reaction between Pyro and Dendro that then applies Pyro onto the enemy every 2 seconds until its duration is over. Burning is very meh as it doesn't really apply that much Pyro and it doesn't seem to do that much damage. There might be some uses in the future, but as of now it's really just kind of bad. And finally we have the Bloom reaction. Bloom is Hydro and Dendro on an enemy, which will create and leave a seed on the ground that you can either interact with by using Pyro or Electro, or you could also just leave it and it will just fucking explode regardless after a few seconds. Or if you trigger too many blooms and there isn't enough space, the older seeds go to college, get old and just die. However, if you interact with the bloom with Electro, you get Hyper Bloom. How creative. Hyper Bloom will turn the seed into a tracking projectile that will seek enemies and deal dendro damage. The Hyper Bloom will scale off the person who triggered the Electro damage, so that can be an Electro or Onimo unit. A character like Fischl won't actually trigger Hyper Blooms often, because most of her damage is single target and won't hit the seed, which can actually in some cases be a good thing, as it means you'll know who triggers it. But in some cases, Oz will just decide to grief you and target the seeds, but it isn't often enough to really hurt your Hyper Bloom comps that much. If you have an Onimo unit and they swirl Electro onto the seed, the damage will scale off their EM, which is great as most Onimo units are built full EM regardless. And you can also use someone like Kuki for these teams who also want to be built with a ton of Elemental Mastery too, or you could also do full EM Raiden. Also, because of the way Electro Charged interacts with Bloom, even though Dendro will normally consume all of the Hydro Aura to make a seed, on an Electro Charged enemy, one Dendro application will create 2 seeds, meaning that teams with really fast Hydro and Electro application can get at a lot of blooms. And since this team already requires 3 units, the core is kind of set out, an Electro, Hydro and Dendro unit along with an Onimo unit to trigger the seeds. And to close off the final Dendro reaction or sub-reaction, Burgeon. Burgeon is when you react with the seed using Pyro, which causes the seed to explode and deal Dendro damage in AoE. Burgeon will also scale off the Elemental Mastery of the unit who triggered the Pyro application onto the seed. So again, that can either be a Pyro or Onimo unit. And you know what? Toma is surprisingly good for Burgeon comps due to his slow Pyro application, while also giving some sort of mitigation as the Burgeon procs hurt to you if you're close to them. And with that, we can finally close out the video. Thank you guys so much for watching this. It has been months of work and rewrites, and I can't wait to finally make a follow-up sometime in 4.0. Hopefully with more preparation. It's just insane to me to think that I was able to document all of this, and I really hope it helps anyone who's new to team building or helps them learn more about that, as that's my goal. If you have any questions, make sure to comment them and I'll most likely respond, or as I said before, feel free to join my Discord server and ask one of the members there. I will also be going back to streaming, but instead of on Twitch, I'll be doing so on YouTube, which will be scary, but we move. Also, once again, massive shout out to all the people on screen who helped me greatly with all this. I love you all and I would not have been able to do this without you. And on that note, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe and comment. Also, please share this around. I would greatly appreciate it. Once again, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.